Today we're going to start our new chapter, which is about how cells harvest chemical energy. In essence, we're going to be talking about cell respiration, which involves the mitochondria. If you remember, that's our powerhouse of the cell. So a little overview, we're going to talk about, first of all, just respiration. In other words, breathing. That brings in oxygen. We're going to talk about how your cells use oxygen and glucose to make ATP, which is a cell's energy currency. And at the end, we're also going to talk a little bit about what's called anaerobic respiration or fermentation, which is what cells do to make ATP if there is no oxygen. So, before we talk about cell respiration, let's talk about where the energy comes from in the first place. So, the energy for our planet comes from, in most cases, the sun. But we can't capture the sun's energy directly in our cells. We can't just lay in the sun and make glucose. We still have to eat food, right? So the organisms, we've talked about this before, that can use the sun's energy to make food are going to be the plants and algae and things that have chloroplasts. And what they will do is a process called photosynthesis, which is actually our next chapter. And in photosynthesis, what the plants have the ability to do is they take the energy from the sun, and then they take in carbon dioxide and water, and they convert the carbon dioxide and water to a more complicated substance like glucose, which is C6H12O6. Oops, sorry about that. And then oxygen is released in that process. And so here's the overall formula for photosynthesis. So you see the carbon dioxide, 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters come in. The energy from sunlight is used to rearrange those atoms into glucose and other sugars, actually. And then oxygen is released, which we need to breathe for cell respiration. So that works out really well for us. All right. So a little bit about calories. We think of calories a lot of times as being a bad thing, but in reality, calories are actually a really good thing. Calories are a measure of how much energy food has. You're not going to be tested on how much a calorie is or have to do conversions of calories. But I will tell you that in chemistry, a calorie with a lowercase c is how much energy it takes to raise a gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So they literally have something called a calorimeter, and you can put something like peanuts or something in there, and you burn them, and you measure how much the temperature of the water goes up, and that's how many calories they have. But the number, that's a tiny amount, actually. A calorie is a very small amount. So when we measure the calories in food, we're not actually measuring calories, we're measuring kilocalories. Or, notice how it's calorie with a capital C, which is 1,000 of the itty-bitty calories. Now, a gram of glucose, which is about like a paperclip weight of glucose, has about 3.811 or about 4 calories. But here's the thing, that's way too much energy to run a single cell process. So I like to give the analogy of imagining that you go to like an old-fashioned gumball machine, and the gumballs, to buy a gumball is $0.25, and you have a $20 bill. Do you have enough money to buy gum? Absolutely. You have enough money to buy a whole bunch of gum. But unfortunately, since the machine won't take a 20, it'll only take quarters, you have too much money and you can't use it. And this is sort of what happens with your cells. Glucose has a lot of energy stored in it. It's a great way for your body and plants and other organisms to store their energy for short terms of time. But each cell reaction really only needs a fraction of the energy in a glucose. Just like how you only need a quarter to buy the gum, and a 20 is just too much, right? So what your cells do is they break down the glucose, release the energy, and capture it in ATP. And so it's sort of like breaking a 20 into a bunch of quarters. It would not be convenient for you to carry around the quarters. So you would only need the quarters when you were ready to go to the gumball machine, right? And you could break your 20 right there, use the quarters right there, and then you're all finished. And so that's what happens. We don't keep ATP around for long periods of time. We keep glucose, and we store it as things like glycogen, or we convert it into things like fat. And then as we require the energy, we break it down and we make ATP, but we use those right away. So this is what ATP looks like. It consists of a nitrogen base called adenine, a sugar called ribose, and then the most important part are these 3 phosphate groups. So ATP, basically provides little packets of energy, like breaking that 20 into quarters, because each cell reaction only takes a quarter. It doesn't need a 20. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. The tri comes from the fact that you have 3 phosphates. Tri means 3. And the energy in ATP really is right here in this bond to this last phosphate. And we don't really get into it in our class too much, but what's happening here, phosphate actually looks like this. And it's got these negative charges on these oxygens. And what ends up happening is all these negative charges repel each other. So these phosphates really do not like being next to each other. This creates almost like a loaded spring. They call it a high energy bond. And when this third phosphate breaks off, it releases energy. And that's how ATP stores energy for us. So it's like a rechargeable battery. When it's charged, the energy is really in that third phosphate bond. When that phosphate breaks off, the energy is released. And it becomes adenosine diphosphate, di for 2, tri was 3, and plus P. That's the phosphate that broke off. So it goes from ATP to ADP plus the third phosphate. Now, when we talk about ATP and your mitochondria making ATP, they're not making ATP from scratch. All they're really doing every minute is recharging this by putting this back together again, rebuilding the ATP from ADP. So here's ATP. You break the phosphate off and you release energy to run cell reactions. Then cell respiration takes the energy from your food, usually glucose, and your mitochondria do this job very well. And they take that third phosphate and they stick it back on. So it's like recharging the battery to be used over and over again. And this picture is showing the same thing. So this is the uncharged version of the battery. This is the recharged version of the battery. Sorry, this is really sloppy. And this process of doing that is cell respiration. And that's why your mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. That's their whole job, is to recharge the ATPs over and over and over again, and they need the energy from sugar to do that. So ATP runs all kinds of cell activities like protein synthesis, active transport. Remember we just talked about that? Lots of things in your cell require energy. Again, it only lasts for a few seconds. You don't store ATP long term. That's why if you stop breathing, you're going to have brain damage within like 6 minutes or something because you're going to run out of ATP. And you don't have any more oxygen now because you stopped breathing to make more ATP. You make very little without oxygen. And so you don't have ATP that you store up for hours and hours and you can just stop breathing and then use all the ATP you stored up. It doesn't work like that. Again, glucose has about 90 times the energy of ATP. So glucose is like that $20 bill and ATP is like the quarters. So, summarizing what we've talked about so far, photosynthesis captures the sun's energy, turns the light energy from the sun into chemical energy in the bonds of sugar, glucose, and then as necessary, ATP is made from the glucose. Now keep in mind, I put a little reminder here, that does not mean plants do photosynthesis and animals make ATP. Plants have mitochondria and chloroplasts. They have both. Plants need energy just like animals do. So pretty much all eukaryotic cells are making ATP. All eukaryotic cells, for the most part, have mitochondria, but plants are just lucky that they don't have to eat to get their sugar. They make their own. But they're still using the sugar to make ATP. In fact, they really just don't use all the sugar they make, and that's why there's leftovers for us, or there wouldn't be any. The plants would just sustain themselves, and there wouldn't be anything left over for the rest of us. All right, so to wrap this up, so in cell respiration, oxygen is taken in, it's broken down into carbon dioxide and water, and then the energy that's released becomes ATP. And again, we just said what's misleading about this statement, that plants do perform photosynthesis, true, but plants also perform cell respiration. So don't think plants do one and animals do the other. All right, and that's where we're going to stop for today, and we're going to get into the details of cell respiration later this week.